am I now? That's the title for this evening's gathering of readers. Our first writer comes to us from Toronto now, via Ottawa, via Trinidad. Please welcome Andre Alexis.
Okay, Martha, start. I'm not going to do any introductions because I guess it's kind of self-explanatory. The gravel pit just outside of Barrow was a jewel or a danger, depending. The pit itself was hidden from view behind a bank of trees and some way along a sandy road. It was nearly circular and some 60 feet in diameter. It had been a long time since there'd been any digging, and the water in the pit was deep. In fact, its depths had been exactly sounded, 30 feet and 7 inches deep at the deepest point, and every once in a while, a young man or young woman, drunk or disoriented, fell into the water and drowned. Lowther had left him about a mile from the pit, but Father Pennant happily walked there on his own. He walked by the side of the road, trampling on young thistles, dandelions, chicory, and tall grasses. The smell of the weeds clung to his walking shoes and rose up so that although he was by the side of a highway, it smelled as if he were in an endless field. The laneway that led to the pit was not hidden exactly, but there were no obvious signs that this particular path led somewhere interesting, rather than to one of the many hidden properties, abandoned farms, or private houses with their snarling dogs. The only hint of the pit's existence was near the locked metal gate before the trees. There on the ground was a rotted but still legible wooden sign that read, Peterson's Gravel. Feeling slightly foolish and vulnerable, Father Pennant climbed over the fence as Lowther had advised him to do and walked the sandy road to the pit. The trees were tall and they partially blocked out the sun, so there was a darkened hush until he came to the clearing. Then, the return of day. The sun shone on a landscape that had been sheared of trees. Before him were hills of reddish sand around which the path snaked. He had rounded a second hill and could see a part of the pit when Father Pennant realized he was not alone. He heard a voice, and then, when he rounded another hill, he saw a man back facing him, standing beside the water. The man was almost fully dressed, light-colored suit jacket, matching pants, but he held his shoes and socks in his hands. Not wishing to disturb the man or frighten him, Father Pennant waited quietly at a polite distance, intending to let him finish what sounded like prayers. But the prayers, which began to sound like a strange song, continued for a while. Then suddenly, the man stepped into the pit and began to walk on water. Having witnessed the miracle of the moths, Father Pennant did not believe what he was seeing. He looked around for something that might explain the lightness of the man or the sturdiness of the water. There was no one about. The man continued across the water, singing or reciting as he went. The water was rigged, surely. There were almost certainly some solid path just beneath its surface. And smiling at what he imagined to be a wonderful illusion, Father Pennant stepped into the water at or near the very point the man had stepped. It was deep water, though, and he sank. His clothes and shoes weighed him down immediately. Sputtering and panic-struck, he managed to turn himself around and pull himself out of the pit. The water was cold, but he kicked off his shoes, grappled to safety, and emerged mud-streaked, soaked, and freezing. Turning back to the pit, he was stunned to see that the man was on the opposite side, looking at him, or seeming to look at him with derision. Poised a moment on the other side, still speaking to himself or to Father Pennant, the man now began his return across the water. If, when he had thought it was a trick, Father Pennant found this water walk charming, he was now frankly frightened by it. As the man approached, Father Pennant recognized George Fox, the mayor of Barrow. Mr. Fox was not speaking English, nor was he paying the least attention to Father Pennant. He looked only before him, enraptured, speaking in tongues. Moses au ne au meu no lux an matu ule matu ogesawi. Hearing these sounds and believing that Fox was possessed, Father Pennant fell to his knees and began to pray. He was in the presence of the diabolical. He knew it. He closed his eyes and said his prayers as loudly as he dared. He was not a timorous man, far from it, but he was terrified to be in the presence of Satan. He felt a hand on his shoulder, and the touch was like fire, despite his wet clothes. "Father Pennant, are you all right?" Opening his eyes, Father Pennant saw George Fox looking down at him. Fox had a broad face in which his small brown eyes were set. His forehead was speckled by freckles. He was mostly bald, and his breath was abominable, like sour milk and rotting chicken skin. Above Fox, the sun ignited a small cloud. "Get thee behind me, Satan," said Father Pennant. "I cannot be tempted." Mr. Fox stood up straight, immediately defensive. "You know, that's pretty unfair," he said. "I'm a politician, so maybe you've heard people say some bad things about me, but I'm as God-fearing as the next man. I may not be Catholic, but that doesn't give you the right to insult me." Mayor Fox walked away with all the outrage he could muster. Very little, as it happened, because he was a generous and warm-hearted man. Not that Father Pennant noticed the mayor's attempt at outrage. He was too busy reciting the psalm he loved best. "As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O Lord." Over and over, until he felt calm enough to stand. Only then did he look up and take stock of the situation. He was alone, shoeless, wet, his clothes covered with grit. It seemed to him that he had seen the devil disguised as Mayor Fox, and Satan, unlike the gypsy moths, was a mystery, as miraculous as loaves and fishes, water and wine. Father Pennant had encountered the Lord of the Flies, and his faith, which had wavered of late, was fully restored. He shivered as he walked the miles back to town, his feet punished by the stones at the side of the road. That evening, Father Pennant was still too upset to do his duties, too shaken to prepare a sermon for the next day, or to visit the old people at Maud Chapman's home for the aged. He sat at the dining table as if turned to lead. Lowther had prepared a lamb roast with roasted potatoes and sweet corn. For dessert, he had made a sticky toffee pudding. The pudding had sat out, aromatically blooming in the rectory as soon as it was taken from the oven. Father Pennant, who loved sticky toffee pudding, put his spoon in the pudding, tasted a morsel, and dispassionately said, "Thank you, Lowther, it's good," before putting his spoon down and looking away. Lowther was, of course, interested in the priest's behavior, but he sat in silence until Father Pennant said, "Do you believe in evil, Lowther?" "I believe men do unspeakable things, Father. I don't know about evil." "Evil is the other side of the sacred," said Father Pennant. "If there's no evil, there can't be anything sacred either. I know that. I know it is God's will that evil exists, but I wish it were different." "I can see you're upset," said Lowther. "Do you mind my asking what's wrong?" "No, I don't mind," said Father Pennant. He told Lowther what he had lived through that day, the climb over Peterson's Gate, his first vision of Mayor Fox, Fox's diabolical traverse of the gravel pit, walking on water and speaking in tongues, and his, that is Father Pennant's, near drowning and long walk home. When he had heard Father Pennant's story, Lowther said, "I'm sorry I didn't go with you, Father. I understand how you can interpret things as you did, and I can see how much you respect and fear Satan. But there wasn't anything satanic about what you saw, nothing miraculous either. Mayor Fox should have told you himself when he saw you so upset. He wasn't walking on water. If anything, he was walking on plastic. I know it'll sound strange to an outsider, but Mayor Fox crosses the gravel pit every year, several times a year, actually." There was a perfectly logical explanation for what Father Pennant had seen. What he'd seen was a foretaste of Barrow Day, the celebrations. There were, deeply planted in the gravel pit's floor, tall columns of thick, clear plastic, some 30 feet tall, almost entirely invisible to the eye. There were 60 of them. They were beneath the surface for most of the year, but in late summer, the water level fell, and you could see them clearly. The tops of the columns were flat and oval, wide enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre Alexis. Our next writer in this first half is Doretta Lau, who is a wonderful young short story writer who lives part-time in Vancouver and part-time in Hong Kong and seems to write for periodicals all around the world. She's a world presence, making a huge impact on the Canadian literature scene. Please welcome Doretta Lau with possibly the longest title. I have to actually look this up because it's got a lot of words. It wins the longest title award for this whole festival. Here it is. How does a single blade of grass Thank the Sun. Please welcome Doretta Lau.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you to the festival and all of the staff and the volunteers. I'm so excited to be here in Winnipeg. All right, so I'm going to read the first story from my collection. It's sort of a time travel story. You'll see why it's only sort of a time travel story. It's called "God Damn, How Real Is This?" My future self sends me a text message at least once a day. The latest: "Hey, Tricko slut, get your man hands out of our hair. I have a Lake Michigan-shaped bald spot forming on the back of my head. Stop plucking. It's starting to look like a penis." Last I checked, there were no Great Lakes of any sort blooming on my scalp, no Superiors or Hurons or Eries flooding my hair. Of late, these missives from the future have become increasingly more abusive. I wonder, when will I flip my bitch switch and hop on this negative self-talk train? In a week? In a year? I'd like to believe this use of misogynistic language is out of character and that maybe I'm being trolled by a bored identity thief. I file the thought as something for my present self to discuss with my now therapist. Another message flashes on my phone. "That mole on your left arm that you've been ignoring? Get thee to a doctor." I peer down. My arm is presenting itself as blemish-free. At times like this, I wish I could send a text message to my future self to make clear the murky. I want to address important issues such as, will I die alone? But that technology hasn't been invented yet, or our future selves have circumvented its implementation for the good of humanity. I call my local clinic and explain my situation. "This is Franny Sue calling. I can't find this mole my future self is warning me about, but I'd like to make an appointment to see Dr. Chang." "I understand," says the woman on the phone. "Last week, my future self started blasting me messages about herpes. Today, she escalated to drug-resistant gonorrhea. I think she's trying to tell me that my boyfriend is cheating on me." "No sex for the hext," I say, unsure how to handle this kind of intimacy with a near stranger. "Come at 2 tomorrow afternoon." "Great, see you tomorrow," I say, and hang up. Despite this disruption, I still have time before my therapy session to stop by my ex-colleague Rita's house and check on her. Rita has not left her house in months because her future self keeps divining death and destruction. As soon as she thinks of doing something, innocuous activity such as watching a movie or washing her feet, a new text arrives, dissuading her from taking action. I pack up some leftover food and a stack of library books, slap SPF 90 sunscreen on my face and arms, and get on my bike. A block from Rita's, I see that chronology purists have purchased a new billboard. Has communicative time travel ruined your life? Our counselors are ready to talk. I think about calling the number listed, but decide instead to stop at a convenience store and pick up additional supplies. The scene indoors is vaguely apocalyptic. The lights are off. Many shelves gape, emptied of goods. Since the texts from the future began arriving 9 months earlier, people have been hoarding canned food and toilet paper out of fear that the new technology has sparked end times. I sigh. Spoiler alert, present-day peons, it's our appalling behavior that blights our existence. I grab a loaf of bread and head to the counter. The clerk is wearing a bulletproof vest. "What if I shot you in the head?" I ask. "The vest wouldn't do you much good then." "Do you think you're the first to ask that, smartass? My future self has already pointed that out to me. Thank you very much," he says. "How does the store stay afloat without the scratch and wins?" I ask, motioning to the bare strip of space under the plexiglass countertop. 3 months ago, the government suspended all forms of gambling. I miss the surprise of running a toonie across a scratch card, that sick joy of self-inflicted failure that's preceded ever so briefly by hope. "That will be $10, please," he says, pointing to the bread. I reach Rita's house and speak through the front door. Hey, I'm leaving you some gazpacho. The ingredients are organic. I triple filtered the water. There's also a loaf of gluten-free bread and the books you asked for. No answer. The smell of feet lingers in the air. Just send me a text, I say. My phone pings with a message from present Rita. Thanks, Franny. There's $20 for you under the doormat and a book that needs to be returned. Your recent actions are fashioning me into an enabler, I say, stooping down to look under the mat. I don't like who I am becoming under your influence. No answer. I text her. Your future self is Chicken Little. Your future self has become your mother. No response. I move on. My therapist, Kelly, does not have a cell phone. She's a chronology purist. She wants her life to play out exactly as it would have if communicative time travel had not been invented. I don't get how this is possible, given that the timeline has already been breached, but logic is not my strong suit, so maybe I'm missing the point. Sometimes her future self tries to get in touch with her via my phone, but present Kelly has instructed me never to pass on any information. I'm in the uncomfortable position of knowing that the majority of her stocks will tank in the next 6 months. Though I suppose if I do pass on the information, it would be classified as insider trading. I keep my mouth shut, we both stay out of jail. I wonder if I should look for a new therapist. How is your week? Kelly asks. I worry I am a misogynist, I say. My future self is really fond of calling me a slut or a whore, which I find puzzling because I never use either of those words. I'd be much more likely to refer to myself as a douchebag. What at present do you think is causing this negativity? I don't know. I'm frustrated with the fact that I can't communicate with my future self. I mean, I guess I could leave notes for her in my journal, but I don't know if she'll ever see them. What can you do right now that will make you feel better? I guess I could write a letter to myself and you can give it back to me 6 months later. Okay, do you want to try that this week? Yes, I say. Our time is up, she says, standing. Until next week. As soon as I leave the office, a new message arrives from my future self. Hey, Ricketts Breath, have you taken your calcium and vitamin D supplement today? I hit delete. Kelly's future self is angry with me. I'm going to have to raise my fees to cover my losses, so you're the one who will suffer if you don't tell me to sell the stock. I decide to write 2 letters, one to my future self and one to Kelly's. The next day at the doctor's office, the waiting room is a cacophony of phones beeping and bleeping. Everyone looks anxious. I know now that ignorance is Eden. If I knew how to code a virus, I would direct my future self to send the inventor of communicative time travel a diseased email to avert this reality. I text Wilson to meet me at 2:30 at a coffee shop across from the clinic. I need someone to talk to in case I have terminal cancer, and he replies with immediate affirmative. The receptionist, who does not look ill, calls my name and leads me to a private room. Dr. Chang appears after a few minutes. He examines my arm and says, do you think that maybe, and I don't want to sound judgmental, that your future self suffers from a touch of Munchausen by proxy? What makes you say that? You've been here 7 times during this past month. You complain of future ailments, but in actuality, they're merely imaginary diseases foisted upon you by your future self. I read somewhere the child is the father of the man, I say. Are you still pulling your hair out? Did my future self contact you about that? Yes. I'm sorry we have no boundaries, I say. Also, isn't my condition just Munchausen? I mean, I'm still me, even in the future. No proxy. Dr. Chang gives me a look that indicates that he is the medical professional and I am just a poor excuse for a patient. I leave his office in shame. My diagnosis? Dormant Munchausen by proxy. Wilson is late for our meeting at the coffee shop. My hand wanders to my tresses. My phone pings. Whorebag, place your man hands where I can see them or I'll shoot. I sigh and fold my hands in my lap. The last thing I need is for my future self to become suicidal and send an assassin my way. 15 minutes, 3 hairs, and 4 text messages later, Wilson rolls in on a skateboard. Konnichiwa, he says, kissing me on the cheek. Nice dress. Those wheels become less and less an acceptable form of transportation with each passing calendar year, I say to him. I broke up with Cynthia, he says with a shrug. I live for today. 2 months ago, Wilson's future self went silent. No texts or email. He concluded that his future self was dead, so his motto became Carpe Diem. He made a bucket list, which included things such as climb Mount Everest, learn Japanese, and eat yogurt for the first time ever. Everest was a bust, summit, avalanche, and he's lactose intolerant. I suspect this list could be the reason for his early demise, but I haven't said anything because I don't want to be a killjoy. Did you get a haircut, I ask? I did, that's why I was late. So, how did your appointment go? My doctor says I have dormant Munchausen by proxy, but I think it might just be plain Munchausen since I'm doing it to myself, I say. There's now a hold on my insurance for a month, and I can only seek medical help in life or death situations. Also, Rita still won't leave her house. Forget your troubles, I'm here. Come to the park with me, Wilson says, grabbing my hand. Is there a cliff you want to jump off of? Something like that. Better, actually. Also, I stopped drinking coffee, and I don't like the way they serve tea here. What's better than jumping off a cliff, I ask. You'll see, he says, smiling. We leave on our separate vehicles. I reach the park first. Wilson shows up with a fresh bruise on his arm. I fell, he says. I wish my future self were alive so he could send warnings. Everyone is afraid to live now, I say. You should be thankful for the radio silence. I'm nearly done everything on my list. There's only one thing left. What is it, I ask. He points to something in the trees. I gaze up in search of this final thing, sure I'm about to witness some new kind of beauty, but I don't see anything. When I look back at Wilson, his face has traveled in his inches from mine. He kisses me. I close my eyes and think only of the present. We separate. He smiles. I feel the same way about you too, I say. His phone pings. A look of surprise lights up his face. It's a text from my future self. You magnificent bastard, it reads. I'm glad you stopped being a scared little pansy and chose to live life. Don't fuck this up for us. I love her. He turns off his phone, but not before I glimpse the rest of the message. Tell her to get that mole on her left arm checked. Thank you.
And our third reader for the first half is David Alexander Robertson. He's been creating really gripping and wonderful graphic novels for the last few years and is now emerging with his first literary fiction book called The Evolution of Alice, a really wonderful book. Please welcome David Alexander Robertson.
Thank you. Oh. We're going to have a little bit of trouble with this, Mr. Bergen. There we go. We're both tall. That's the joke. Thanks, Charlene. Thanks for having me out. I thought a lot about the topic tonight, and I found the perfect story, I think. So when Alice loses her youngest daughter, Grace, it forces her to look through her life through a brand new lens, and everything in her life changes. And part of that evolution is her struggle between desperately wanting her daughter back and being haunted by the memory of her daughter. And her decision is described in this excerpt from the novel called Staring at the Sun. She thinks of the past, all those yesterdays. She wants them back. No tomorrows. She dreams asleep. She dreams awake. The dreams are nightmares, even the pretty ones. The pretty ones are the worst. Alice reaches for the remote, her distraction. She flicks the television on. It's Dora. Alice imagines Grace, her baby, is in front of the television set, telling the characters where to go. She touches the glass with her dirty fingers. She gets smudge marks everywhere. She always gets smudge marks everywhere. When Alice wants to watch her shows at night, everything's out of focus from the fucking smudge marks. But Grace isn't really there. Alice flips through the channels, settles on a daytime talk show, midday bullshit. The picture is crisp and clear, no dirty fingers, no dirty glass. She would do anything to have to use Windex. She lies down on her side, pushes a pillow underneath her head, and curls her legs into her stomach. She sticks the remote between the pillow and the couch. Her baby is crawling on top of her, bending down so her face is obstructing Alice's view of the television set. She wants attention. The more annoyed Alice gets, the harder Grace laughs. She tosses her baby to the other side of the couch. Grace laughs. What a fun ride. She crawls back over to Alice, crawls up to her shoulder, lowers her head. Stop it, Alice says. Grace laughs. She crawls all over Alice's body like goosebumps. But Grace isn't really there. Alice wishes for the weight against her shoulders. She wants her baby to annoy her, wants to shout at her. She wants goosebumps. She falls asleep and dreams she is listening to Grace breathe, listening to her talk, savoring words like a delicacy. Her voice is sharp, sifting effortlessly through stagnant air, through the aroma of stale cigarettes. Alice moves with the sound along the air, through the window, into the cool morning breeze. She looks at Grace from the outside, her baby's eyes melting into her cheeks with that smile. Then she blends into the breeze and is gone. When Alice wakes up, she thinks for a moment. She is back beside Grace, her tiny breaths like warm kisses, her tiny cheeks squished against the couch, a trail of saliva drizzling from her lips, her tiny feet pressed between Alice's thighs, but her baby isn't really there. Alice's breaths are her own. Her face is cold and lonely. Alice makes breakfast for Kathy and Jane in the morning. They pile out of their bedroom sleepy, their feet dragging along the floor, their hair dancing every which way like flames, their eyes adjusting to the light. She makes 2 more plates than the ones she prepares for Kathy and Jane. She always makes 2 extra plates. One of the plates almost always gets eaten while the other does not. But Gideon isn't there this morning. That means he's either sandbagging or for some extra cash or with his grandpa at Innis General Hospital. She doesn't blame him, of course, but the girls look sad in his absence. He makes faces out of the bacon and eggs. The over-easy eggs are eyes. The bacon is a mouth. The girls laugh so much at that. So one plate lies uneaten in front of Alice. She won't eat it. The other plate is in front of Grace's booster seat. Alice imagines her there. She picks up the bacon like a lollipop. It's more a toy than food. She licks it, chews it, bangs it on the plate like she's drumming, like she used to see her daddy do. She eats around the yolk. She hates the yolk. Sometimes she'll sneak it onto Kathy or Jane's plate. They'll eat it, but Grace isn't there. The bacon and eggs will get cold, jealously untouched. Alice watches Kathy and Jane eat. They are tidy about it. They are quiet, too. It wasn't always this way. They used to eat like hungry res dogs. She wonders if they see Grace, too, like she does. Alice will send them back to their room after breakfast. She wonders if her baby will be there, if she'll play tea with them, or run around bugging them as Kathy tries to read and Jane tries to color. Of course she will. She always does. But Grace isn't there. She looks around the room, the kitchen, the living room. She thinks about the hallways. It leads to the girl's bedroom, her bedroom, and the bathroom. There's nowhere else to go. The trailer is small, so small that her baby can be everywhere. The walls hold memories inside like cigarette smoke. She looks at the booster seat, the uneaten plate. She runs out of the kitchen, down the hallway, into her bedroom. She's gasping for breath. The tears blur her vision like the memories. She rushes to the corner of her bedroom, rummages through a pile of dirty clothing until she finds 2 black duffel bags, one of them emptied, one of them full. She unzips the full bag, dirty men's clothing, tube socks, tighty-whities, jeans, T-shirts, a hooded sweatshirt, Ryan stuff. She rummages through the bag, pulls out a faded red Spider-Man T-shirt. She holds it out to inspect it, the ink stain on the left shoulder, the hole along the right side. She used to like that she could see his skin through it. She scrunches it up and holds it against her nose, breathes violently. Clean laundry. He always smells like clean laundry, no matter what he did or where he went. She changes into the T-shirt. It's loose and makes her look ragged, but she doesn't care. She zips the duffel bag up and slides it flush against the corner of the room, piles dirty clothes back onto it, either to hide it or protect it in her absence. She takes the other empty bag and fills it with clothing, hers, Jane's, and Kathy's. The girls' clothes smell like Ryan. They are like him in that way. Grace, too. Alice packs just enough clothing to get by. There's always Walmart in the city. It's cheap there. Big and crowded, but cheap. She calls Olive for a ride. Where to, Olive asks. To the city, Alice says. Where are you going to the city? You haven't been out of your house in forever, Olive says. Will you take me there, please? I can't be here anymore, Alice says. There is a silence. Alice wonders who else would take her. She doesn't want to ask Gideon. He'll ask too many questions. And she doesn't want to talk about it. She just wants to go. He'll ask her to stay. I'll be over in a bit, Olive says. Alice hangs up the phone and dials her cousin Krista in the city. She has a big house in a bad neighborhood. She and the girls have stayed there before. How long do you need to stay for? I mean, not like it matters. Shit, you can stay here forever if you want. I like your kids better than mine. I don't know, a while. Long enough, Alice says. Long enough for what? Krista says. I don't know, Alice says. It doesn't matter. Just come by whenever you can, Krista says. Alice brings the duffel bag to the kitchen and puts it down beside the kitchen table. Jane is finishing her food. She didn't notice Alice run out of the room, but Kathy, she notices everything. She looks at her mother with big, concerned eyes. Are you okay, Mommy? Kathy says. Alice nods. She looks back at her baby's booster seat. She looks away quickly, as though she'd been staring at the sun. But we have to go now, Alice says. Jane pokes her head up from the plate. Where are we going, she says. Away, Alice says. Now. Leave your plates, just come with me. Jane cries out in excitement. Kathy gets up quietly. She picks up her plate to bring it to the kitchen sink. Alice shakes her head. I said leave it, Alice says. Kathy puts her plate back on the table. Alice throws the duffel bag over her shoulder, takes Kathy's hand, takes Jane's hand, and guides them out of the trailer. Alice waits near the end of the driveway, her feet almost touching the line of rocks she made after Grace died. Her baby, she would have had so much fun on those rocks. She would have played with them in so many ways. She would have jumped over them like hurdles. She would have leapfrogged over them and got her legs caught on top of them. She would have said she was stuck and got one of her big sisters to help her down. Of course, she could have got down on her own. She knew her big sisters would do anything for her, though. She was smart. Jane plays basketball, throws all different kinds of balls into the hoop, and cheers each time. Kathy doesn't play. She stands by the old hockey net and stares at her mom. After a few minutes, an old K car pulls up alongside the highway. Olive honks the horn as though Alice hadn't seen her. Sarah is in the back seat, ready to entertain the girls for the 2-hour drive. She looks excited, hasn't seen the girls in a long time. Come on, darlings, Alice says. Jane bounds down the driveway, leaps over the rocks, and gets into the car almost in one motion. She bear hugs Sarah. You want the window seat? Sarah asks. Yeah, Jane says. Sarah swings her over to the driver's side window. Jane laughs. Sarah turns and waits for Kathy, who approaches the car methodically. She walks slowly down the driveway, steps over the rocks, and slinks into the back seat. Hey, Kath, I missed you, Sarah says, and pats Kathy on the knee. Me too, Kathy says distantly. I missed you, Jane says. Sarah laughs. Oh, I missed you too, Peanut. Alice gets into the passenger seat and positions the duffel bag firmly between her feet. Olive glances at the bag. How long are you planning on staying? Olive asks. I'm not sure, Alice says. A little while. That doesn't seem like a little while kind of bag to me. It's enough. Olive takes her hand off the gear shift and places it on Alice's shoulder. You sure about this? Olive says. Alice plays with an old luggage tag tied to the zipper of the duffel bag. She thinks of when she flew to Anchorage with Ryan. It was the only other place she'd been other than the city. She'd left Grace to go there. She could do it again. Alice, are you sure? Alice nods. Let's just go. Olive hesitates only a moment longer. She puts the car into drive, does a U-turn across the empty highway, and drives away from Alice's trailer. The girls are quiet then, even Jane. The roar of the car's motor, the hum of the tires against the highway, the air whistling in through a crack in the passenger side window, all sound deafening. Alice sees the worried and confused faces on her girls, wonders if she's doing the right thing. But then she looks back at their home, watches as the trailer gets smaller, and her swing, and the tree, and the field. Grace is there. She is hiding in the long grass from her sisters, confounding them. She laughs, and it seems as though the grass is giggling as it flutters in the breeze. She is picking blades of grass from the ground and trying to braid them into her hair unsuccessfully. She is bouncing up and down, so in the distance it looks as though she is swimming in a lake of golden water. Alice looks away to the highway, to the gray and the open road. She thinks of the city where it's big and distant, and she can hide within its cold embrace. "Where are we going, Mommy?" Jane asks. "Away," Alice says, "far away." "How far?" Jane asks. "Far enough." Thank you.
Welcome, Martha Bailey.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you all for coming. This book starts in a small town in Germany and then it moves to the Arctic. But I have a feeling the man in purple is going to cut me off long before we get to the Arctic. Heinrich Schlogel's life is being pieced together by an archivist, so I'm going to start with the archivist's note. Archivist's note. Of course, Heinrich Schlogel is often mistaken for someone else. In airports and cafes, men and women approach, tell him how deeply familiar they find his face. They assure him he is a school teacher or TV host, that they've worked together on a civic action committee or been introduced while sailing or folk dancing. Heinrich stares at these people and tries to imagine where he might have seen them before, but can find no clue, not in their chins, eyes, or mouths. He does not like accusing them of being in the wrong, but is forced to conclude that the error is theirs. With mild regret, he notes how gratifying it feels to be enthusiastically recognized, even as someone he isn't. Part 1, Tettnang. Chapter 1, The Naked Eye. Like all living creatures, I had a mother and father, but I never knew them. I know that they met each other last summer. For several days they flew side by side and together sipped from the same flowers. Then for several days they united. During this union, my father pressed the tip of his belly against my mother. It is in this way he was able to slip tiny grains into her body, grains so small no person could see them with his naked eye. Animals and their families, the butterfly. The sentences that Heinrich loved best were hard as rock candy and lasted. As a child, he did not read with ease, but listened and remembered. What was read to him he savored. His favorite books were those that depicted the lives of animals. The person he most admired was his older sister, Inga. In a letter dated October 30th, 1980, and postmarked Toronto, a letter central to my archive, Inga addresses a friend, recalling, "Whenever the farmers sprayed the fields, straight away our maid was sent out with a bucket of soapy water and a sponge to clean off my swing set in the back garden, so that if I went out to play, I wouldn't be poisoned. The day after the tractors left, pulling their tanks of pesticide behind them, I'd slip through the gate, cross the wild area that sloped down from behind our garden to the hops fields, and disappear among the rows of tall, heavy-laden plants. I collected birds from the ground. Those that had only just died lay limp and warm in my hand. I dropped each delicate body into the cloth sack I'd taken from the handle of the kitchen door, the sack my mother filled at the market with vegetables, fruit, sausage, cheese, and bread on market day, which was Tuesday. Every few meters, another corpse lay at my feet. I buried them in the wild area on my way home, but first I sat with them, heaped beside me, and examined each one. admiring the colors that came into sudden existence as I twisted a wing so it caught the sun at just the right angle. The hardness of a beak and the softness of an eye, these became mine and could not be taken away. The burial was unceremonious. If in my eagerness I'd forgotten to bring a small shovel, I dug up the soil with my fingers. On very clear days, when everything was bright and hard-edged, as if made of glass, I could see out of Germany and into Switzerland by leaning from my bedroom window. To look beyond Tettnang, beyond Germany, enabled me to breathe better. I do not know if my brother Heinrich felt a similar tightness in his throat and chest whenever he read the sign in the central square, "A cordial welcome to Tettnang." But if he didn't, it was because already in his imagination he'd left for Canada. Until recently, I like to believe that I helped him find his way to Canada. But what has happened now has changed everything. I have no clear idea where he is. Heinrich, my younger brother, had a different temperament from mine, yet we were very close. Should I use the past tense when I speak of him? Will any of us ever see him again? I am choosing the present tense. He has a different temperament from mine, yet we are very close. As a child, Heinrich feared his maternal grandfather. It was summer, and out the back door of his grandparents' house, Heinrich went. Someone had given him a pair of roller skates. Abrupt wooden stairs led down to the garden where a paved path waited for him. On the top step, he sat and began to attach his roller skates to his shoes. As he struggled with a stubby metal tongue that had to enter the tiny, uncompromising hole in the red leather strap, his grandfather's legs, or rather the sharp pleats that ran the length of his grandfather's trousers, appeared beside him. "Wouldn't you do better to wait and strap those on at the bottom of the stairs?" a voice inquired from above. The voice was not a voice he knew well. He visited his grandparents infrequently, and years later he would forget entirely the sound of his grandfather's voice. The perfectly pressed pleats, however, and the impeccable shine of his grandfather's pointed shoes, these would resist time. They'd persist, totemic, almost legible, the purveyors of Heinrich's inadequacy. He had not thought of descending the stairs before strapping on his roller skates. He did not belong among those who thought ahead. Throughout his youth, Heinrich's reasoning would undulate rather than slice or pierce, and quite often would sink out of sight, submerged in murky emotion. It would sway back and forth, pulled by currents of anxiety. His second memory of his grandfather was of a hunched man in a wheelchair, engaged in the act of disappearing. It frightened Heinrich to have to stand and greet this figure whose clothes fit well but whose skin did not, and whose words fell sloppily from his mouth. A man reaching out with his eyes from within his own uneasy departure. "You never knew him," said Heinrich's mother, Hélène, years after her father's death, in a tone mildly accusatory, mildly angry. Either she was angry at having lost her father or frustrated with Heinrich for having been born too late. Heinrich rarely knew for certain what his mother felt. "My father was a man of great wit," she explained. "He had style and demanded punctuality. If I lingered in bed, he'd come into my room in the morning, open the curtains, throw open the window, and shake my feet." Hélène stared down at her feet, and Heinrich stared at them also. Square, short-toed, they were the only visible part of her that was not beautiful. How did Heinrich feel about his mother's feet? I too am German, from Munich to be precise. But this gives me no special insight. I cannot know how he felt about his mother's feet. My search for Heinrich Schlogel began with a photograph in the newspaper. Suddenly, there he was, a young man walking down University Avenue. He was in profile. And so I could not be sure of his expression, determination mixed with confusion. I noticed his vigorous stride. Two passers-by, approaching from the left, were turning to stare in his direction. If I succeed in finding Heinrich Schlogel, do I have the right to ask him any question I like? It is mostly through speculation that we exist for others and for ourselves. That he was being photographed disturbed him, I imagine. According to the newspaper, several people pulled out their iPhones to capture him. My tiny Schlogel archive is bursting. I am collecting as much evidence as possible. My search for the truth about Heinrich Schlogel is far from over. At what pace Heinrich's days elapse is hard to say. No dates delineate them. His days are neither placed in a clear order nor prevented from flowing into each other. Past and present tense become interchangeable. He seems to be approaching Mount Asgard. His arrival at the base of the Turner Glacier feels imminent. And then nothing happens. Both landmarks vanish from his map. He deliberately or unconsciously shrinks his handwriting, perhaps in an effort to conserve paper within his journal. I assume that he fears running out of paper. He writes, "If this is a photograph, I am that tiny detail that serves only to reveal the overwhelming proportions of the whole. I am part of the composition. As soon as a composition makes itself clear, everything stops moving." He had to contend with river crossings and did not always time these well. The best and safest spot to cross was rarely self-evident. It could be where the river braided out, separating into several strands, or higher up before this dividing occurred. Very early in the morning, when the day had not yet warmed, or on a cloudy day, the volume of melted glacier pouring into the river was less, and the river less forceful. He thought he heard thunder, but it was the rumble of concealed rocks being carried toward him by the silty white current. He placed a foot blindly. He remembered to undo the chest and waist straps of his backpack so that he could escape from its weight were he to lose his balance. His second foot touched the stony bottom.
The final reader this evening needs no introduction in this hall. He's been one of my favorite writers for quite a long time now, and I'm always delighted when there's a new novel. Please welcome David Bergen with Leaving Tomorrow.
The thing to do if you were a boy in junior high was to fight. Bev had a reputation as a solid fighter, and he never lost. And because I was his brother, I was expected to be a fighter like him. I wasn't. Fighting scared me. I sidestepped confrontation, and when it came, I resorted to muteness or avoidance. And when I finally did speak, my words came out in a flurry, incomprehensible to those who had never learned to read and write properly. I was tall, which helped. And Bev was my brother, which proved a blessing at first, but eventually it was discovered by the tougher kids that, unlike my brother, I wasn't a willing fighter. Severn and Stu Turk were brothers at our school. They were tough and mean, and for no explanation, girls were attracted to them. Severn, the younger brother, had it in for me. Perhaps he didn't like my clothes, or the fact that I called him scurrilous or a scallywag, words he didn't understand. This would have been during the S stage of my close perusal of the concise Oxford English Dictionary. In any case, a confrontation with Severn loomed. This was the era when we still lined up before entering school, and Severn took to standing behind me in line and jeering, "Hey, Swiss boy, give us a yodel." Severn thought that my family name, Vulgamut, was odd, and because he was just bright enough to know that the name was German, he took to calling me Adolf and Volkswagen and asking me where my clogs were. The first time I took him seriously and I explained that it was the Dutch who in fact wore clogs, and then I tried to explain the origin of my name. It's actually vol, which means well, and gemüt, which means mind. I went on to explain that the Volkswagen was simply the people's wagon, and that as far as fine machinery and inventions and quality ideas go, the Germans were unsurpassed. Severin sneered. His face looked concave like a spade. In his large nostrils were the two rivets that attached the tool to the handle, which was his tall, lanky body. He pushed me, and I stumbled backwards. Still happy, Vol? He asked. I felt despair. The kind of despair that just comes without warning and makes it hard to breathe. I sucked in some air and said that I would be much happier if I could be left alone. He laughed. Meet me after school, he said, behind the shitter. I have no desire to fight. Fighting is for baboons and male lions who seek a mate, I said. No desire? Who do you think you are, Desire? What's wrong with you? He worked his hands in circles as his mouth sought out his words. I wondered if this was finally my punishment for the sin of carnality. Perhaps I even wanted to be punished. Even so, I was still leaning towards self-protection. What do you want? I asked. He paused, and his small eyes blinked as if this were not a question to be considered. Then his body sank slightly, and he said, I want to fight you. I want to beat the shit out of you. But why? What do you mean, why? There is a scene near the beginning of Madame Bovary in which Charles Bovary arrives at a new school and enters the classroom and throws his hat against the wall like the other boys in the class because it was the thing to do. Bovary is laughed at and ridiculed, not least because he is awkward and slightly stupid and new to the school. I was a bit like Charles Bovary, though I knew I was not stupid. I was far better read and more intelligent, but I was Bovary for other reasons. I was awkward, did not know all the rules, was unfamiliar with the social cues, which made me prone to mockery and bullying, and like Bovary, I was the opposite of cosmopolitan. If I had any intrigue or sophistication in me, it was gained through reading, which for me was the most dangerous form of learning because it was done with little complexity. I was a void sucking up all knowledge. And this being so, I was also a lover of character, and I wanted to be someone other than myself. I wanted to be a character in a novel who elicited sympathy and pity and affection, and who would go on to marry a very beautiful woman, even if it was a woman who would destroy herself and her family. Even at my young age, I understood that I could have been a better lover than Charles Bovary. One of the great pleasures of reading, especially reading done on a ranch in Alberta by a young boy who wants more, is the possibility of other lives, the possibility of extending one's arm and being pulled through the curtain onto a stage where Swan is in love, and Emma rides her carriage in circles through the city with the blinds drawn, and Joyce's hapless boy is infatuated with Mangan's sister, for whom he will buy a trinket at the market. I was that boy who rode the train to the bazaar, and I had failed to get the trinket. That afternoon, I had a presentation in language arts. I had chosen the topic of fish because of where I was born and because I knew a lot about Pacific Coast salmon. Unfortunately, I was unaware that the other students resented my foreignness, and that they resented even more my constant references to the fact that I had been born on a boat. I liked to tell this story, thinking it was interesting, but at some point others usually became bored and said, shut up, Volgamut, and they walked away. But during the presentation on fish, I once again mentioned my birth circumstances, and at this point, Mr. Singleton, our teacher, stopped me and said, Arthur, we've heard this story before. Perhaps you could save it for a special occasion. Maybe tell it once a year. I nodded and looked down at my notes. Severin was guffawing in the back. I realized that everything in my presentation hinged on the metaphor of birth and life and the struggle of the salmon upriver and their inevitable death. And this being so, and because I had been cut short on the birth part, I was lost. I managed to finish, but it was a poorly done talk, far too short, and very much lacking in clout. I basically offered up fish facts, and then I sat down. Mr. Singleton asked if there were any questions. Sonia Rempel, who had passed me love notes in grade 2 and had since then up through the years dated most of the boys in our grade, including Severin Turk, and was therefore considered a bit fickle, raised her hand. If you were born on a Japanese boat, wouldn't that mean you were Japanese? The class roared. Mr. Singleton smiled and then said, okay, enough. I waited until the snickering had abated, and then I said that it was a brainless conclusion to make. It would be like saying if she, Sonia, had been born on a bed manufactured in Russia, then she was Russian. But I am almost Russian, Sonia said, wagging her shiny blonde hair. My mother was born there. I, at that point, was dealing with imbeciles. I sat down, pretending arrogance, yet I felt a deep humiliation, especially because Mr. Singleton, whom I hated at that moment, seemed to have enjoyed the repartee. Flaubert in January 1837 wrote, I felt very early a profound disgust with men from the moment I came into contact with them. From the age of 12, I was sent to school. There, I saw a shortcut to the world, its vices in miniature, its origins of ridicule, its little passions, its little coteries, its little cruelty. I saw the triumph of force, mysterious emblem of the power of God. I saw faults that would later become vices, vices that would become crimes, and children who would be men. Oh, what a fine and incisive mind. What a resemblance to my own life, my own ideas, my world. When the bell rang to signal the end of the school, I picked up my bag and I ran. Certain that Severin was coming for me, I ran outside and towards the nearby pasture. I climbed over the barbed wire fence and went out into the middle of the field, and I sat down. A large limousine bull, which had been shipped over from France, grazed in the distance. Severin had followed me, of course, and he paused outside the fence and he called out, Hey, fish boy, you collecting more bullshit? This was a comment full of wit, and I wondered if Severin was smarter than he appeared. I should have been terrified of Severin, which I was, but also of the bull, because the limousine is an unpredictable animal and much more dangerous than a Brahma. But I knew this particular bull. The man my father worked for, Dewey, had had several limousine bulls shipped over the previous year, and it had become my job to care for them, to feed them. It made perfect sense to me, the victim of Severin's violence, to run straight for the pasture near the school where this limousine, with its broad forehead and wide pelvis and dark, brooding eyes, grazed. What a fine, supple hide, muscular hindquarters, testicles like bowling balls. The bull watched me carefully. The bus arrived, and the kids climbed on, and so Severin disappeared. Finally, alone, I moved slowly to the edge of the field, climbed over the fence, and walked home, arriving just in time for supper. I spent the following week, every lunch hour and after school, in the pasture with the French bull, who came to understand that I was a tepid intruder. One day at supper, my brother said, Just fight him already. Surprise him. My mother nodded. She was ruthless, certainly able to see the damage that might be done to her little boy, yet unwilling to protect me. I did not understand her. My father said, Let him be. And I hated him for saying that because it meant he pitied me. Finally, 2 weeks later, full of resolution and dismay, I met Severin behind the outhouse. The whole school population, 77 students, had heard of the fight, and they were present, forming a ring. I removed my glasses and put them in my jeans pocket. I stepped towards Severin and raised my fists in a half-hearted manner. He swung and hit me in the temple. I fell back. He swung again and caught my mouth. Fight, you dick, he said. It's against my principles, I said. This infuriated him, and he pummeled me until I fell to the ground. The crowd cheered, and a few girls, tender souls, gasped and called out for him to stop. Bev was at the edge of the circle. He stood quietly, looking disgusted, hands in his pockets. To Severin's credit, he did not kick me when I was down. He pulled me to my feet and hit me again and again in the breadbasket across the face, around my ears and neck. I fell again, and by this time the rabble had grown quieter, and Severin was panting. The crowd dispersed. We all went back to our classes. I cleaned myself up and returned to my homeroom and sat down and pulled out my notebook. I had a loose tooth, and I worked at it with my tongue the rest of the afternoon, but it did not fall out. Nettie Running Wolf, who was half Blackfoot and rarely said a word, passed me by on the way out of school and placed a folded piece of paper on my desk. I opened it later at home in my bedroom and discovered a pressed flower, yellow, with Lily written beneath it. At supper that evening, my mother surprised me when she accused Bev of standing by and doing nothing. Is that what a brother does? Earlier, she had iced my jaw and cleaned my face with a warm cloth, muttering all the while about boys and violence. I did not mention my loose tooth because of my oversized fear of our family dentist. The last time I had visited him, he had found 7 cavities and filled them all at once, muttering above me, joking with his assistant, a tall redhead who tittered and snorted and pressed her chest against me as she suctioned up my saliva and blood. Like other women in my life, even those who merely brushed up against me, I loved her. My mother daubed at my eye and said, You should take boxing lessons. He won't touch me again, I said. How can you know that? She cried. He just won't. He garnered no pleasure from this. Oh, Arthur, who taught you how to talk? She shook her head, and I thought it was fair and good that my mother and I managed to bewilder each other. Thank you very much.